Stay close. We are almost there.
By the time the first man screamed that it was a mermaid, 7 of his friends were already dead. Not dying. Dead. One folded over the rail of the fuel dock with half his chest missing. Another dropped beside the floodlight tower and never even had time to release the safety on the machine, gun slung across his shoulder. 2 more were still in the skiff they had used to circle the inlet, drifting sideways now, the outboard coughing once and then falling silent as the boat eased into the rocks. The others were harder to see clearly in the storm glow and muzzle flashes, but the effect was the same. Men who, 10 seconds earlier, had believed they owned the night were suddenly grabbing at wounds they did not understand, spinning towards shadows that offered no shape, no muzzle flare, no target, only the black sea and the silver skin of the surf. Then the water itself moved. A pale face broke the surface between 2 teeth of basalt. Not fully, just enough for moonlight to strike wet glass, black grease paint, and the slick crown of seaweed that had caught on a hooded head during hours in the shallows. To frighten men with old stories in their blood and too much adrenaline in their veins, it looked wrong. Human, but not human enough. A ghost with a rifle. A woman of the reef. Something half-born from the tide. "It's a mermaid!" One of them shouted in his own language, voice cracking so high it barely sounded like a soldier at all. Then the figure rose higher. Not gracefully, not magically. It came up with the brutal efficiency of someone who had spent half the night motionless in 48-degree water and no longer cared about elegance. A suppressed rifle cleared the foam. A gloved hand found the stone. One knee planted into a shelf of coral slick as ice. The man above the dock turned, saw 2 cold lenses fixed on him through rain and salt spray, and opened his mouth. The shot hit him at the base of the throat. He dropped backward into the floodlight housing, shattered the bulb, and plunged the entire east side of the inlet into darkness. That was when the screaming really started. On the trapped side of the dock, beneath a wall of corrugated steel and bullet-chipped concrete, Lieutenant Nate Coulter tasted blood in the back of his mouth and knew the fight had just changed. 20 minutes earlier, he had been calculating how long his team could survive before the tide forced them from cover. 12 minutes earlier, he had been choosing which wounded man to move first if the enemy tried another push. 8 minutes earlier, he had started making the private, ugly peace that professional men make when they realize rescue is not coming in time. Now enemy voices were breaking all across the inlet. Now, there were bodies falling in places no friendly shooter should have been able to reach. Now the heavy gun on the gantry had gone silent. And somewhere beyond the pilings, out in the surf where nobody could have survived that long without being torn open on the rocks or frozen into uselessness, an unseen shooter was dismantling an entire perimeter 1 deliberate round at a time. Nate turned his head toward the water and saw almost nothing. A flicker. A shadow between swells. The faintest line of movement where movement should have been impossible. Then he understood the one fact that made the rest of the night suddenly terrifying in a completely different way. Chief Elias Van was still alive. 3 hours earlier, Van had vanished during the break. No splash anyone could locate. No shout. No body. Just a burst of tracer fire over the inlet, a violent churn in the outflow channel, and then nothing. Nate had locked the loss away because there had been no space to do anything else with it. Men in his line of work learned that pain had compartments. Grief went in one, breathing went in another. Mission first, mourning later. If there was a later. But Elias Van was not dead. He was out there. And the men who had spent the last hour laughing at trapped Americans, dragging hostages onto the pier for leverage, and shouting in a loudhailers that the tide would finish what bullets started, had just discovered the oldest truth in combat. The most dangerous thing on a battlefield is the variable nobody accounted for. Another shot cracked soft and ugly through the suppressor. A militia spotter pitched off the catwalk and struck the dock so hard Nate heard ribs break onto the rain. A third shot. The man working the radio relay at the generator shack jerked once and collapsed into the equipment rack. Sparks spat blue through the slats. A fourth. One of the skiff pilots, trying to cut free from the rocks, snapped backward, hands flying off the tiller, and the boat drifted broadside into the surge. The enemy stopped firing in disciplined bursts. That ended immediately. Now they were spraying into water, into darkness, into superstition. Muzzle flashes stitched across the inlet. Rounds slapped the tide. Tracers skipped off Black Rock. Men shouted over one another, some calling ranges, some calling names, some just panicking. And still the unseen shooter kept working. One round for the machine gunner. One round for the squad leader crawling toward the detonator line. One round for the man leaning over a bound hostage with a pistol, trying to make himself look brave in front of the others. Each shot arrived from a place their brains rejected before their bodies had time to understand it. Low, wet, unnatural, as if the sea itself had learned marksmanship. On the dock, one of Darcy's lieutenants dragged a terrified young fighter behind a stack of fuel drums and hissed that no one could shoot from the water like that. Not at this angle. Not after this long. Not in this swell. He was still talking when a bullet punched through the seam between the drums, crossed 6 inches of rusted steel and trapped rainwater, and entered through his cheekbone. The young fighter screamed the word again. Mermaid. Because men in panic do not reach for accuracy. They reach for stories. If you like long stories about impossible odds, quiet professionals, and the moment fear changes sides, stay with me all the way through this one. And tell me where you're watching from, because this night began far from any map most people could point to and ended in a place none of the survivors ever forgot. Rewind 6 hours. Before the gunfire, before the bodies on the dock, before an entire militia started shooting at the ocean, the night had looked almost calm. That was the first thing Lieutenant Nate Coulter would remember later when the interviews were done and the reports were sealed and the official language had reduced a living nightmare into neat, sterile paragraphs. The sea had looked calm. Not safe. Never that. But calm in the way a predator sometimes lies perfectly still before it commits. The inlet sat on the eastern edge of Carrot Atoll, a volcanic crescent so small and so badly charted that most civilian shipping routes ignored entirely. On satellite imagery, it looked like a broken thumbnail in the middle of a dark ocean, a ragged ring of basalt, mangrove, and old concrete scars left by a foreign military that had abandoned the place decades ago. During the Cold War, somebody had blasted a fuel pier into the rock, poured foundations for radar towers, and cut an outflow channel through the reef. Nature had spent the years since tried to take it all back. Salt had gnawed the steel. Moss had invaded the bunkers. Root systems split concrete like knuckles through plaster, which was exactly why Cassim Darcy had chosen it. Darcy had once worn a Navy uniform for a government that no longer existed. Then he had sold ships, then routes, then men. By the time the intelligence community started treating his name like a problem instead of a rumor, he controlled enough smuggling infrastructure to move missiles, fuel, hostages, medicine, or entire platoons through 3 littorals without touching a legitimate port. He did not think like a pirate. He thought like a quartermaster with a talent for cruelty. He understood choke points, supply ladders, maintenance cycles, corrosion, fuel burn, and what happened to frightened civilians when you trap them somewhere wet and isolated and let despair do half the work. 2 weeks before the operation, Darcy's network had hijacked a survey vessel carrying a guidance package that should never have been anywhere near commercial water. 9 crewmen were killed during the boarding. 14 survivors disappeared. Signals intelligence tracked fragments of encrypted traffic to Carrot Atoll, then lost them again under weather clutter and deliberate electronic noise. Overhead images showed fresh activity at the old radar station. Temporary shelters, drum storage, 2 patrol skiffs. Enough armed men to matter. Not enough at first glance to justify a conventional assault that might get hostages killed. So the mission went to a team built for ugly spaces between certainty and catastrophe. Nate Coulter led the assault element because he had the one combination of traits command trusted and subordinates followed. He was calm without being slow, aggressive without being reckless, and incapable of pretending that luck was a plan. 36 years old, lean in the way distance runners are lean, From a dry town in eastern Oregon where his father had repaired irrigation pumps for 40 years, Nate had learned early that machinery failed predictably, people less so. He spoke softly, checked everything twice, and under stress became almost unervingly polite. Men found that comforting right up until the moment he gave an order in a tone that allowed no interpretation at all. His corpsman was Ben Ruiz, compact and broad-shouldered, with square hands, a wedding band tied into the cord of his dog tags because he hated how rings felt under gloves. Ruiz had grown up in San Antonio, could repair a busted suction unit with duct tape and determined patience, and carry trauma shears wrapped in bright yellow tape, so nobody could ever lose them in the dark. He had a daughter who sent him drawings of sea animals no matter where he deployed. Half the animals looked like potatoes with eyes. He kept them folded in a waterproof sleeve inside his admin pouch. Theo Weller handled communications and fires. He was the tallest man on the team, all knees and elbows until equipment went on, after which he moved with the careful economy of someone who knew exactly how much mass he was carrying and where every antenna, battery, and cable lived. He came from Gloucester. His father and grandfather had fished cold water all their lives. Theo trusted weather the way some men trusted hunches. If he said a squall line would break or current would shift, people listened. Mick Tolan was the breacher, a former collegiate wrestler from Ohio whose size made strangers underestimate how precise he could be. Mick smiled often, spoke little, and loved mundane details with an almost religious sincerity. He could spend 10 minutes talking about hinge placement and the acoustic difference between hollow core and solid doors if he thought it mattered to the mission. It usually did. And then there was Chief Elias Van. Every team has one man the others respect before they fully understand him. Elias was that man. Not because he was loud. He was the opposite. He wore silence the way some people wore cologne. He came from Ketchikan, Alaska, where rain fell sideways and boys learned tide tables before they learned algebra. He was older than Nate by 4 years and looked weathered in a way that had nothing to do with age. His face had been shaped by cold, salt, and squinting at distances. He had the patient eyes of a hunting guide and hands so still they could make a living thing feel relaxed right before it was tagged, treated, or killed. Officially, he was the team sniper. Unofficially, he was the man who noticed things nobody else noticed until later, when they understood those things had been the whole story. He noticed that Dartsea's skiffs were moored on the leeward side, even though it made fuel transfer slower, which suggested Dartsea expected either bad weather or an approach from the open water. He noticed from imagery that one drainage line on the old fuel pier had been cleared recently, not by maintenance crews, but by someone physically moving silt and debris with tools. He noticed that the radar tower shadow on the afternoon pass fell wrong, meaning the top assembly had probably been modified. He noticed that 3 gulls circling the eastern rocks never settled there, which meant something on that side of the island was disturbing them at irregular intervals. When he briefed, he did it without drama. Eastern outflow channel matters, he said over the mission table aboard the assault ship, one blunt finger resting on a salt-faded image of black rock and surf. Current is ugly on the ebb, but when the tide turns, there's a 6 to 8 minute slack window inside this pocket. Long enough to move a man if he knows what he's looking at. Theo looked at the image. Move where? Elias tapped beneath the pier. Under them. Mick lifted an eyebrow. That tunnel flooded. Most of it. Most of it doesn't help. Elias just shrugged. Depends what you're willing to get. I got a short laugh from Ruiz. Nate did not laugh. He watched Elias a second longer, then asked the question that mattered. Could he shoot from it? Elias studied the map, the tide data, the projected moonlight angles. If I had to, would you have comms? Maybe. For part of it. That's not comms. No. Nate nodded once. That was enough. The operation itself was simple only on paper. Insert by combat rubber craft under low light. Beach on the southwest reef cut. Move inland through the abandoned pump house complex. Confirm hostage location. If the hostages were viable for extraction, seize and move them to a temporary hold on the old fuel dock where a secondary boat would retrieve them at nautical dawn. If the hostages were rigged as human shields or the guidance package was being prepared for transfer, the team would mark the station for offshore fires, breach the holding area under the confusion and get out before Darcy's outer pickets could close. Ugly, narrow, fast. No one liked the weather. A pressure band had come down from the north sooner than forecast, flattening the air and turning the evening horizon into a slab of iron. The kind of weather that swallowed rotor sound, muddied thermal signatures, and made every wet surface twice as treacherous. The kind fishermen described with one glance and a mouth pressed thin. Theo stood by the rail before launch, feeling humidity on his face, and said, "This guy's thinking about violence." Mick checked the breaching pouch on his vest. "Good. So are we." Ruiz snorted softly. Nate did his last equipment sweep. Elias said nothing at all. He was staring out across black water toward an island nobody on deck could yet see, as if he were not looking at distance but remembering it. The boats launched at 21:30. Engines stayed low. Men stayed lower. The rubber hulls slapped lightly over dark swells, then settled as they entered the lee of the atoll. Somewhere overhead, masked by cloud, a surveillance platform watched and fed what it could through intermittent weather breaks. Offshore, beyond the horizon, steel waited with more steel. But once the team crossed inside the reef line, the mission became intimate. Salt on lips, diesel in the nose, cold water creeping through seams, the scrape of gear against rubber. No orchestra, no grandeur, just trained men entering a place where people with guns had already decided to do terrible things if pressed. The island appeared gradually, as bad things often do. First the darker line against dark water, then the basalt shoulders. Then, as they closed, the blunt geometry of old military construction jutting from the rock like rotten teeth. Nate counted 3 visible structures from the southwest approach: the pump house, a half-collapsed generator shed, and a main station farther inland on higher ground. No visible patrol on the beach. No light discipline issues. No cigarettes. That alone bothered him. Too neat, he thought. At 200 meters, Elias touched the bowman's arm and pointed. Bioluminescence. Not everywhere. Only where the water disturbed against a series of low, nearly submerged stakes running in an irregular line off the southern reef cut. The helmsman adjusted instantly. They ghosted wider. Fishing stakes would not have been strange, but these were too evenly spaced, too fresh, and set where no sane fisherman would risk his gear during rough weather. Obstacles. Maybe markers. Maybe something worse. At 100 meters, Nate keyed the throat mic once. Hold noise. Hold profile. The boat slid through a narrow lane between rock teeth and touched the inside shallows with almost no sound. Men disembarked into knee-deep water and moved fast. The beach was barely a beach at all, just a smear of crushed shell and volcanic grit beneath leaning palms. The air smelled of salt rot and old fuel. To the right, the pump house door sagged on one hinge. To the left, mangroves crowded the edge of a stagnant pool filmed with rainbow slick. Somewhere inland, metal knocked softly against metal in the wind. Everything looked abandoned, which was wrong, because abandonment has a texture. Debris settles. Rust blooms evenly. Paths disappear. But here, the wrong things have been cleared and the right things left untouched. A route through weeds. A fresh boot scuff on concrete. A hinge recently oiled. The place was pretending to be dead, and that meant it was awake. They moved inland in 2 files, all discipline and shadow. Nate in front with Elias offset. Theo carrying the long burden of communications gear like he had been born beneath it. Ruiz centered. Mick near rear security. No one spoke except in taps, glances, and the kind of compressed hand language that seemed to happen before thought. At the pump house, Elias paused and crouched beside the wall. Fresh scrape marks on the foundation. Boot traffic. Multiple sizes. Recent. He held up 3 fingers, then pointed north. Nate nodded. Inside the structure, the air was close and damp. Broken gauges hung from pipes. A nest of cables ran through a trench cut into the floor. Mick checked the service door and found what he expected. Alarm contact. Modern. Hidden badly to anyone not looking for it. Obvious to him. He disabled it in 4 seconds. That was the first confirmation that the island was not merely occupied. It was layered, defended by someone with enough discipline to respect routes of entry, enough paranoia to prepare for professionals, enough confidence to leave bait where amateurs would miss it. They exited the far side and advanced uphill through scrub. And that was where the first thing went wrong. Not a shot. Not yet. A sound. Soft. Metallic. Almost delicate. Theo's head snapped left. Elias froze. Nate raised a fist. Everyone locked in place. For half a second the island seemed to inhale. Then a string of low charges detonated in the mangrove washed behind them. Not to kill, but to announce. Flash and concussion rolled through the dark. Hidden bells of corrugated metal clattered from 3 positions at once. Floodlights snapped on over the fuel dock and the lower yard. Not all of them, just enough. The old radar mast began turning with a sick mechanical groan. "Move," Nate said, calm as a man ordering coffee. The hillside erupted. Rounds came down from the generator's shed, from sandbagged windows above the dock, and from a machine gun position none of them had seen because it had been built inside a gutted fuel tank with a slit cut through the rusted skin. Dirt jumped. Basalt chipped. Palm fronds disintegrated overhead. The team broke exactly as drilled, but drills are elegant only until real bullets begin subtracting options. Mick rolled behind a cistern wall and returned fire in precise measured pairs. Theo hit the mud behind a concrete footing and tried to raise the overwatch platform. Ruiz dragged himself and his aid bag behind a broken retaining wall just as a round split the rock where his head had been. Nate and Elias moved to bound toward the upper station and got cut off by a second burst from the flank. Ambush line left and high. Theo snapped. Seen. The machine gun on the dock walked fire across the slope. This was not panic shooting. Someone had pre-sighted lanes. They knew exactly where an assault element would try to break once the alarm went. Then came the second thing that turned bad into worse. Through the rain and tracer wash, the main station door opened. Hostages. Not all 14. 6 first. Bound at the wrists, shoved onto the upper catwalk where every shooter on the island could use them as backdrop and shield. Men and women in stained coveralls, faces hollow with dehydration and fear. One stumbled and was yanked upright by the collar. Another had a bandage dark with old blood around the side of his head. A guard forced them against the rail and shouted something in a language Theo did not catch under the firing. Then a larger voice came from a loudhailer. Measured, educated, mocking. American team, you are seen. You are contained. Every mistake now is yours. Kasim Dartsy. Nate felt the night narrow. No clean fires. Not with hostages exposed like that. No immediate assault on the catwalk. Not without a ladder of casualties. No quick retreat. Their beach lane was now lit, probably covered, and maybe mined by the same people who had turned the pump house into a trigger funnel. He risked a look uphill. A figure stood in the doorway above the hostages, dry under the overhang, one hand on the loudhailer. Not armored. Not posturing. The kind of man who did not need to shout to believe he controlled the room. This was professional work, Dartsy called. I expected that, which is why I prepared. You should be proud. You got farther than the last ones. Nate did not answer. Professionals do not debate from bad cover. Elias fired once, aiming not at Dartsy, but at the loudhailer itself. The device exploded in the man's grip. Guards flinched. Hostages screamed and ducked. For one thin second, the entire upper platform lost cohesion. Shift, Nate ordered. They moved right, using that instant to drop downhill toward the dock structures where concrete and steel might at least block some of the machine gun fire. It was the least bad option, also the one Dartsy had probably intended them to take. The slope broke under Ruiz first. Mud sheared off over old poor drainage, and he slid 6 feet before catching himself. Mick hauled him by the vest, shoved him ahead, and took a ricochet across the side plate hard enough to stagger. Theo nearly lost the long antenna array on a rusted pipe. Nate covered. Elias disappeared behind a curtain of spray as rounds chopped the brush around him. Then a rocket-propelled grenade hit the retaining wall they had just vacated. The blast lifted hot debris, stone, and shredded root into the air. Nate felt impact in his teeth. Theo went down. Ruiz crawled to him immediately. Mick leaned into the machine gun with disciplined anger. 3 shots, pause, 3 shots, forcing Gunner to button up for half a second. Status, Nate snapped. Theo coughed mud. Alive. Comms. He checked the set. 1 glance was enough. Primary's gone. The aerial lay in pieces. Darcy had done his homework. First alarms, then light, then pre-sighted kill lanes, then hostages, then comms attrition. He was taking apart the team's options in a sequence that would look almost elegant to anyone detached enough to admire it. They reached the lower fuel yard by sheer violence of will. Concrete pilings. Rusted drums. A loading crane frozen in place decades earlier. Enough hard cover to survive for a while. Not enough to leave. And somewhere in the break between upper ground and lower yard, in the confusion of tracer fire, spray, and shattered light, Elias Van vanished. Nate saw him last at the edge of the drainage cut, low and moving, rifle slung higher than usual, turning his head once toward the eastern outflow channel, as if checking a landmark only he understood. Then a machine gun traversed. Water geysered in the cut. An explosion went off from somewhere behind the generator shed. The whole line of sight disappeared in steam and mud. When it cleared, Elias was gone. No voice on comms. No acknowledgement tap. No body. Just absence. Chief. Nate called once, because sometimes the first rule of staying alive is refusing to surrender a man to assumption. Nothing answered but the machine gun. He locked it away. There was no time. Darcy's men closed the noose deliberately. Not rushing. Professionals rarely rush what already belongs to them. Fire from the catwalk. Fire from the shed. Fire from the dock edge. A skiff engine starting beyond the pier. The tide turning under all of it, slow and sinister, beginning its inward push through the outflow cut and the lower yard drains. At 22:38, Ruiz took the first casualty treatment of the night when Mick caught frag in the outer thigh. Not life-threatening. Painful. Mobility degraded. Ruiz worked under cover of Nate's rifle, hand sure, voice level. You still with me? Mick clenched his jaw. I was hoping for a night swim instead. Not in that leg. Rude. At 22:44, Theo got partial backup comms through a secondary handset by climbing just high enough behind a steel bulkhead to point the emergency antenna toward the storm break offshore. He got 9 words out before a round punched through the handset and showered him with plastic and copper. At 22:51, Darcy's men dragged 2 more hostages onto the mid-dock and tied them where everyone could see them. One of them was a gray-haired engineer whose face had gone beyond fear into the strange, exhausted calm of a person who has spent too long imagining his own death. At 22:58, the flood started to matter. Water pushed through the yard drains and swirled around boots, carrying diesel sheen and rotted leaves. It licked the bottom step of their cover position. Theo checked his watch, and then the tide charred his head. 35, maybe 40 minutes before this shelf becomes useless. Nate ran numbers. Not enough ammo for a full breakout uphill. Too much enemy control on the beach lane. No comms certainty. Hostages exposed. 1 wounded. 1 missing. Weather worsening. The offshore support package blind, unless given positive confirmation and precise coordinates, they could no longer transmit. This was the part civilians rarely understood when they imagined special operations. Not the action, the compression, the narrowing, the way an entire mission can become a math problem solved in blood and minutes. Darcy knew it too. His men stopped pressing hard and started talking instead. Calls across the yard. Offers in bad English. Surrender. Lay down weapons. Medical treatment. The usual theater. Not because they expected compliance, but because language can be a weapon when people are tired, cold, injured, and try not to drown. Nate ignored all of it. Ruiz ignored it. Mick ignored it. Theo ignored it. But the thing about pressure is not that it makes disciplined men break. It is that it forces them to think clearly while the body begs them not to. That takes a different kind of strength. Quieter. Less cinematic. Much rarer. And what none of them understood yet was that the night had already begun turning in a place no one on the island was watching. When Elias Van disappeared into the drainage cut, he was not improvising from nothing. He was committing to the worst contingency on the board. The outflow channel on the eastern side of Carrot Atoll had been blasted through volcanic rock 30 years earlier to let warm generator runoff and fuel wash disperse into the sea. Once the installation died, storm surge and neglect did what they always do. Concrete cracked. Rebar bloomed. Coral colonized the lower lip. Sections collapsed inward, leaving a jagged throat under the dock complex that flooded and emptied with the tide. On paper, it was unusable. In practice, it was worse than that. It was usable only by someone willing to trust charts, timing, lung discipline, and pain tolerance more than fear. Elias had clocked it in the imagery, then again during the final tide brief, then a third time when their approach lane showed freshly disturbed bioluminescence near the eastern rocks. Somebody on the island had been moving through or near that water. Maybe not the full channel. Maybe just clearing enough to check it. But that was enough. If Darcy knew the eastern side mattered, then the eastern side mattered more than the main gate. So when the ambush snapped shut and the hill became a slaughter funnel, Elias made a decision in under 2 seconds. Not to fight the trap, to leave it. He dropped into the drainage cut feet first, because diving headfirst in black, debris-filled runoff was a good way to become a corpse pinned under concrete. The water took him immediately. Cold. Hard. Not ocean cold. Not the grand, clean cold of open northern water he grew up in. This was confined, dirty, battery acid cold, fouled with old fuel and algae slick. His shoulder hit wall. His thigh hit submerged rebar. Bullets chewed the surface above him in fast silver zippers. He tucked the rifle package close, kicked once, and vanished under the lip before any shooter on the bank could draw a useful line. The channel almost killed him in the first 10 feet. A collapsed brace snagged his fins. Silt detonated into blindness. Something sharp raked the side of his oxygen rig. He backed up by feel, rotated, sliced one fin free with a line cutter, then wormed himself through a gap narrower than his chest rig wanted to accept. Training keeps men from panicking. It does not keep the body from trying. Heart rate spikes anyway. Vision tightens anyway. Instinct screams for air even when logic knows the tank is full. The thing about Elias was not that he lacked fear. It was that he had spent years teaching his body that fear got a vote, not command. He cleared the brace and entered the main throat of the outflow where current did the rest. It hauled him through darkness beneath the yard. Under concrete, he could feel vibrating faintly with gunfire above, and into a pocket where seawater and runoff mixed in a swirling chamber the size of a small room. From there, the channel split. One branch choked and dead-ended. The other angled toward the east pilings beneath the fuel dock. He anchored himself behind a slab of fallen concrete and listened. Above him, boots, voices, metal on metal. He checked his watch against tide progression and did the calculation he would never later bother explaining in full to anyone outside the team. Slack window on the outer lip in a little over 20 minutes. Until then, the surge would be too chaotic to surface with control. So he stayed submerged at the edge of the pocket, breathing through a low-profile rebreather, rifle sealed in a drag bag, body temperature leaking steadily into poison cold water. Up above, the rest of the team fought for minutes they did not know he was buying. Time to strange things in cold water. It stretches and sharpens. A man notices details because he has no use for anything large. The grit in the glove seam. The way current changes pressure behind the knees. The metallic taste that comes when adrenaline and stale oxygen mix at the back of the throat. Elias counted breaths, counted surges, counted enemy footfalls whenever they crossed the dock above his position. From the cadence, he marked at least 8 fighters using the east side alone, probably more rotating through. He also heard something else. Superstition. 2 younger sentries speaking in hurried whispers above the grating, trading some local reef legend about women in deep water who called men by name before storms. One laughed too loudly. The other told him not to laugh about it here. Elias stored that away because everything mattered. Fear, accent, age, the way one man's boots squeaked and another's dragged slightly, as if favoring an old injury. A sniper works in details the way other men work in maps. When the tide slackened, he moved, not up, out. He let the current pull him through the last teeth of broken culvert and into the outer surge pocket beyond the dock. The sea hit like a fist. Open cold. Vertical motion. Hard undertow dragging at the legs. Black rock inches from his left shoulder, reef wash exploding white against it. He stayed low, hooked one arm through a natural slot in the basalt, and waited for the set to pass. Then he edged laterally through kelp and broken foam to a shelf with a sight line into the eastern yard. From that position, he could see only fragments. A corner of catwalk, the lower machine gun nest, the generator shack roof, portions of the dock edge between stacked drums. Not enough to fix the whole battle. Enough to start taking it apart. The rifle came out of the drag bag dry. He checked the optic. Clear. Checked the bolt. Clean. The first shot he took was not at a man. It was at a floodlight. Glass burst. Darkness expanded. Enemy eyes, already night-fragile under artificial light, lost their depth perception on the entire east edge of the fight. The second shot was the gunner resetting the traverse on the lower machine gun. The third was the forward radio operator. The fourth was a skiff helmsman. After that, momentum did what momentum does. Confusion compounds faster than certainty. Once fighters started believing someone was shooting from the water, half their training evaporated into ancestral terror. Men are modern only until they are not. Give them darkness, dead friends, and a threat that defies the mental frame they prepared for, and suddenly you are not fighting a militia. You are fighting the child buried inside every armed adult who still remembers that night belongs to things he cannot name. Back under the yard overhang, Nate recognized the pattern before anyone said it aloud. Single shooter. He sighed, suppressed, picking capability first. He risked a peek and saw a body on the machine gun platform, another by the relay rack, another half in and half out of skiff. No random spread, no wasted rounds. This was Elias. Or was somebody built from the same blueprint? Ruiz looked up from Mick's leg. Tell me that's who I think it is. Nate kept scanning the dark. If it isn't, we still appreciate the help. Another shot. Catwalk guard down. Theo's face changed. Not relief. Hope was too dangerous for that. But the shape of the fight had altered, and professionals can feel that almost physically. He grabbed the broken backup comms, stripped the ruined jack with his teeth and knife, and began trying to rewire signal from components that were never meant to be field-married under incoming fire. What are you doing? Ruiz asked. Buying our ghost a bigger hammer. The real problem was that even perfect shooting from the Eastern Rocks could not solve the hostages alone. Darcy understood this faster than his men did. Within a minute of the first impossible kills, he adapted. Floodlights off. Internal movement only. Pull sentries back from exposed rails. Put hostages lower and deeper. Shift command node away from visible doorways. He stopped showing himself. That alone made Nate respect him more and hate him faster. Arrogant men stay exposed too long. Dangerous men disappear and keep thinking. Then Darcy introduced the next layer. Fire. Somebody in the upper station rolled a burning drum down the service ramp into the lower yard. Not to ignite the whole place, but to create moving light, smoke, and reflections. Flaming fuel spread in a crooked sheet across rainwater and diesel sheen, turning parts of the dock into a hellish mirror where every shadow looked false. Good move. It complicated Elias's angles and made the lower cover hotter, brighter, and harder to defend. Mick looked at the fire, skidding toward a stack of rotted pallets. That feels personal. Everything's personal now, Nate said. The rain thickened. Wind shifted. Smoke rolled low across the yard instead of rising. Theo managed to get a whisper of static through the rebuilt line, and no more. Not enough for support. Not enough even for a clean burst. Just enough to remind them that somewhere beyond the storm there were friendlies listening to emptiness. Ruiz checked temperatures by touch because instruments were no longer trustworthy. Mick was losing heat and blood slowly. Theo had cuts embedded with plastic from the shattered handset. Nate had a crease along the forearm he had not bothered to bandage. Water climbed to mid-calf around their position. And then one of the hostages started screaming. Not in panic. In pain. Darcy's men had moved the 6 visible prisoners off the upper catwalk and down in the maintenance gallery that overlooked the lower dock through rusted steel lattice. Hidden enough to protect, visible enough to threaten. Someone inside the gallery had decided to prove seriousness by hurting one of them where the trap team could hear it. That is how intelligent cruelty works. Not loud, precise. Ruiz's jaw locked, so hard Nate could see the muscle jump in his cheek. "What's our move?" the corpseman asked. Nate looked at the tide, the gallery, the eastern dark where death kept coming in quiet, expensive little packets, and knew the answer was not yet visible. That was the thing about nights like this. Plans did not announce themselves. They emerged from pressure like metal from mold. You had to hold long enough to see them. Out on the eastern rocks, Elias shifted position again. The burning fuel had created glare that made his current shelf less useful. So he dropped back into the surge pocket, moved 20 yards along the reef under cover of spray, and found a new perch inside the shadow of a collapsed mooring dolphin. Worse footing, better angle. From there he could see into portions of the maintenance gallery through gaps in the lattice. He also saw something more important. Deck cord, thin, nearly invisible in the wet, run along the inside support posts and down the gallery stairs toward a junction box near the generator shed. Not enough to destroy the whole station. Enough to blow the gallery and everyone in it into the yard if Darcy lost control and wanted to deny the hostages as assets. So that was the play. Trap the assault team below. Use hostages to block fires. Rig the hostages as a dead man cost if overrun. Wait for tide and fatigue to finish the rest. Sensible, cruel, efficient. Elias breathed once, long and slow, then changed his target priority. Capability first always. But now capability included demolition. He waited for the man guarding the junction box to shift his weight clear of the housing, then fired through the seam where old metal met newer hinge. The round passed through, struck the trigger assembly, and showered the position in sparks. The guard spun and dove. Another fighter rushed in to inspect the damage. Elias put him down before he reached it. Above the lower yard, 2 more fighters leaned from cover to locate the shot. One died instantly. The other recoiled, screaming, and in that scream the old word came back out. Mermaid. It spread because fear likes easy names. Men on the west side heard it and laughed until another impossible kill hit one of theirs from a direction no shooter should have survived. Then they stopped laughing. Soon the word crossed the whole compound, mutating in the rain from mockery to warning. Do not go near the east rail. Watch the water. She is in the water. It is in the water. The reef woman. The sea ghost. Whatever each frightened brain needed it to be. Meanwhile, Elias kept being exactly what he was. A coal man with a rifle and a job. Back in the yard, Theo heard the relay box die under the shot and understood the implication before Nate did. He just cut the gallery trigger. You sure? Not sure. Pretty close. Close is enough. Nate made the next decision instantly. We move when he breaks their eyes again. Ruiz tied off, mixed bandage harder. He breaks their eyes? Nate looked toward the eastern dark. He always does. That line would matter later because it spoke to something people outside these units rarely grasp. Competence creates faith, not blind faith, not fantasy, something harder. Teammates who have watched a man make correct decisions under pressure often enough begin to build around that reliability. They do not worship it. They integrate with it. They plan through it. And sometimes on the worst nights of their lives, they survive because they know exactly how that man thinks when the world narrows. Elias broke their eyes 30 seconds later. Not with a round, with power. The generator shack sat half open behind slatted steel and patch conduit. Its backup line fed the surviving dock lights, the gallery interior lamps, and Darcy's improvised radar sweep. One exposed cable junction ran down an outer support post where weatherproofing had failed years earlier. The rain had done half the work. Elias did the rest. He put a round through the wet junction box. The entire east side detonated in blue-white arc and went dark. At the same instant Nate moved. He and Mick surged from lower cover toward the service ramp, while Ruiz and Theo laid suppressive fire on the gallery slits and catwalk corners. It was not volume. It was precision aggression, the kind that makes defenders keep their heads down half a second longer than they want to. In close fights, half a second is often the whole budget. Mick hit the first stair hard despite the leg wound, shoulder into rusted railing, breaching charge already in hand. Nate took the landing, fired twice into a doorway shadow, and stepped over a falling body without looking down. Ruiz followed, dragging the aid bag and carbine together with a movement that should have been awkward and somehow was not. Theo stayed low, firing and updating an imaginary map in his head with every muzzle flash above. The gallery door had been chained from the inside. Mick smiled a little because of course it had. He placed the strip charge exactly where the latch load would fail, shielded the fuse from rain with his body, and murmured, "Door's about to reconsider its life." The blast tore metal inward. Inside, the world became 8 feet wide and terminally immediate. One guard on the left, weapon halfway up, died to Nate. One on the right lunged for the nearest hostage and took Ruiz's round high in the shoulder, then another from Theo through the center mass before he hit the floor. A third farther back tried to get to the remaining debt line. Mick drove him into a support post so hard both men disappeared into steam, dust, and old insulation. Then the hostages were there. Real, shivering, bound, eyes huge in the dark. Ruiz slung his rifle and started cutting wrists with the yellow-taped shears. "You can move, you move," he said. "You can't, point to what hurts." One woman, maybe a survey tech in her 20s, grabbed his sleeve with freezing fingers. "There are more," she said. "Below. Some below." Nate's head came up. "How many?" "I don't know. Maybe 5. Maybe 6. They took them when you came." Of course they did. Darcy had split the hostages. Insurance on insurance. The thing about layered enemies is that they force layered rescues. There's always another room, another compartment, another trap beneath the one you just bled to reach. And then Darcy himself re-entered the fight. Not visually, by voice. This time through the internal speaker system, cracked by weather and age, but still functional enough to pour across the compound like a disembodied presence. "You should not have come up here, Lieutenant." Nate scanned the gallery, weapon leading. "No sign. You've improved your position," Darcy continued, "but not your situation." As if to underline the point, automatic fire erupted from the west storage sheds into the gallery windows. Darcy had pulled fighters from the exposed east side and massed them where Elias's angles were worst. Smart again. Forced the team to protect freed hostages inside a thin metal box while the tide traps them for below and the west flank closes. Theo cursed softly. He shifted his weight. Nate keyed his dead mic from habit, then let it go. He had to. Below them, the lower yard had become a dark inland, sea cut by floating debris and strips of flame. Their old cover was gone. The service ramp was half submerged. The beach escape lane might as well have been the moon. And what none of them knew yet was that Darcy had one last structural advantage he still believed belonged only to him. Beneath the main station ran an old fuel transfer tunnel connecting the storage cisterns to the dock pumps. Mostly collapsed, partially flooded, too tight and toxic for routine use. But Darcy's engineers had cleared enough of the inland section to store the remaining hostages in a room off the tunnel where thermal overhead would struggle to distinguish bodies from heated machinery and salt-soaked concrete. He assumed no assault force would find them in time. He also assumed no one outside his own people understood how the island breathed beneath the surface. He was wrong. Elias had entered the tunnel system from the opposite end 3 minutes earlier. After covering the gallery assault with the power shot, he dropped off the mooring Dolphin in a chest-deep surge and moved along the outer seawall until he found the old transfer intake hidden beneath a curtain of weed and barnacle. The opening was barely visible even at close range, a dark square exhaling warmer water into the storm wash. Exactly the kind of detail Darcy's men would trust too much because they had worked so hard to make it invisible. Elias keyed his short-range mic once. No transmission would reach the rest of the team through all that reinforced concrete and weather. The gesture was habit and timing, a way of marking the phase change in his own head. Outside shooter. Inside hunter. He entered feet first, pulling the rifle behind him. The tunnel smelled like every dead industrial place in the world. Mold, rust, oil, hot metal, rotting insulation, trapped humidity. Water sat ankle-deep over concrete in some stretches, waist-high in others. Pipes ran low enough to crack a skull. Wiring hung in loops. The dark was absolute until he risked the shielded red lamp once, low and brief, just enough to mark the branches. He moved by touch, memory, and logic. Pump line left, dead. Valve room ahead, maybe open. Air, getting warmer, meaning generator-fed systems nearby. Then voices. One bored, one tired, one younger and trying to sound harder than he was. Elias slowed until even his equipment stopped whispering. He saw them at the turn beyond the valve manifold. 2 fighters on stools outside a steel hatch, rifles across laps, arguing quietly over whether the panic on the east dock meant boats had arrived or spirits had woken. One had his boots unlaced. The other kept glancing toward the hatch as if he hated guard duty near whatever was inside. Elias put both down before either stool finished tipping. He caught the first body before it clanged against pipe. He let the second fall because he needed the sound. From deeper in the tunnel, someone called out. Then footsteps. Fast. Elias backed into shadow off the main line, crouched behind a pump casing, and waited until the next man rushed the corner. 1 round through the eye line. The body piled into the first 2. Behind the hatch came a muffled cry. Hostages. He reached the door and found not chain, not electronic lock, but an old-wheeled dog by 2 modern hasps. Dartsy again. Redundancy on top of history. Elias cut the hasps with a hydraulic micro-tool from his belt, spun the wheel, and opened into a storage room that had once held filters and spare pump assemblies. Now it held 6 civilians. 2 women. For men. 3 of them bound to chairs. 1 lying on a tarp with a fever sheen on his face. 1 older man blinking like he had stopped expecting light to mean rescue. 1 teenager, maybe a deckhand, maybe younger, trying not to cry in front of the adults and failing with all the dignity in the world. Elias knelt to the nearest captive and spoke the first full sentence he had said in almost an hour. I'm with the rescue team. If you can stand, stand now. The older man stared at him, at the dripping hood, the seaweed still caught on his shoulder rig, the face paint, the water running off his sleeves onto the concrete. For one absurd half-second the man looked as if he too was considering the mermaid theory. Then reality won. There are more soldiers above, he whispered. I know. You came from a sea? Yes. God. Not him, Elias said, cutting the first set of bonds. Move. There are moments in stories like this when competence becomes almost mythic if told badly. So it matters to say what actually made Elias dangerous in that tunnel. Not rage. Not invincibility. Preparation, breathing, body control, and a refusal to let urgency become sloppiness. He moved the freed hostages not by trying to rush them through a combat maze, but by triaging immediately. Who could walk alone? Who needed support? Who had to stay low? Who understood simple commands under stress? He gave the teenager the easiest possible task. Keep one hand on the belt at his back and never let go, because people survive better when they have one clear job. He put the older engineer on the fevered man's shoulders with a sling improvised from restraint cord. He memorized their shoe noise because in a tunnel everything is sound. Then he heard the west side of the compound erupt again. Dartsy had committed his counterpush. Above, Nate and the others were now in the maintenance gallery with 12 hostages total, 1 wounded operator, 1 communications specialist with barely functional gear, and shrinking ammunition. Automatic fire hammered the outer lattice. Rounds punched through rust and ricocheted like angry insects. Theo finally got a clean enough burst through on emergency power to send 4 essential pieces of information. Hostages present. Lower dock compromised. Enemy strongpoint west. Request immediate maritime extraction impossible. He had no idea if anyone heard it. Ruiz moved through the captives with brutal compassion. Tourniquet here. Splint there. Water rationed in capfuls. 1 man in shock. 1 woman with wrist damage from restraint. Another with what looked like an improperly healed rib fracture from the boarding days earlier. He kept his voice calm, almost domestic because panic is contagious, but so is steadiness. Mick guarded the breach point, leg wrapped tight, face gone pale under grime. Pain makes some men loud. It made him quieter. Nate watched the west sheds and listened to Darcy shaping the fight. No more mockery now. Just clipped orders. Reposition. Bound. Cover the gallery exits. Bring the reserve team from inland. Darcy had stopped trying to humiliate them and started trying to finish them. That was worse. Then Nate heard something under the gunfire. Pipes. A metallic knocking, irregular at first, then repeated. 3 knocks. Pause. 2. He turned toward the rear service hatch at the back of the gallery, the one that led into the maintenance spine of the station. Ruiz saw it too. Theo shifted. Mick pivoted his rifle despite the pain in his leg. 3 knocks. Pause. 2. Their challenge rhythm from dry run contingency, used only for internal movement when voice might compromise. Nate crossed fast, flattened beside the hatch, and waited. The knock came again. He unsealed the hatch and pulled it inward. A rush of warm, oily air hit first. Then Elias Vance stepped out of the tunnel, looking less like a man than something the island had coughed back up in disgust. Hood dripping, cheeks streaked with salt and grime, rifle wet to the sling points. Behind him, in a miserable, staggering line, came 6 more hostages. For the first time that night, even Nate had no words ready. Elias glanced once around the gallery, counted instantly, friendly wounded civilian totals, approach lanes, ammo state, and said the only thing that mattered. There's a tunnel to the inland cisterns and outflow access. West flank is massing for breach. Darcy's moving to boats. How budding get? You found more hostages? Found the rest. Ruiz looked at the civilians behind Elias, then back at him. Chief, you're bleeding. Elias checked a tear along his sleeve, as if noticing it for the first time. Not significantly. Mick actually laughed once at that. A dry little bark. Nice to see you too. Nate's mind was already turning. Talk to me. Elias crouched by the rusted deck and traced a fast map in rainwater with one finger. West sheds push here and here. Darcy pulls attention forward while he moves the package and command element through the cistern line to the north pier. He thinks east side's cursed now, so he's abandoning it. Tunnel gives us a way under this gallery to the inland tanks. From there we can intercept or bypass to extraction point. Theo shook his head. What extraction point? The sea's eating the dock. Elias looked up. Not the dock. The outflow. Ruiz stared. You want 18 civilians through that. Not through the throat. Through the upper spill chamber. There's a maintenance apron above the channel mouth. If support heard even part of Theo's burst, they'll search the east perimeter because it's the only side with water access not fully mined. Theo frowned. That's optimistic. Elias met his eyes. No, it's geometry. That was the mystery competence reveal, if you want to call it that. Not the shooting. Not even the survival in the surf. The fact that while everyone else had been fighting the island on its own terms, Elias had been reading the island as a system. Its tides, lungs, choke points, habits, blind spots. That is what separates a good operator from the kind of professional people talk about years later in rooms where nobody raises their voice. He had prepared for the place itself, and Darcy had made one final mistake. He thought the Americans were still trapped in the shape of the original ambush. He did not know the battlefield had changed underneath him. Nate made his decision. We move the civilians in 2 sticks. Mick, you hold rear with Theo. Ruiz, triage and order. Elias, your point. We intercept Darcy if we can. If not, we get these people out and mark him for offshore kill. Everyone clear. Nobody wasted breath answering the obvious. Then the west sheds breached. Automatic fire tore through the gallery front in a sheet of sparks and shattered rust. One hostage screamed. Another dropped flat. Mick and Theo returned fire instantly, punching 3 fast lanes through the slits. Nate slammed the service hatch shut behind the last civilian and dogged it. Ruiz shoved the able-bodied hostages toward the tunnel entrance. Single file, hand on shoulder in front. If you stop, everyone stops. Do not stop. The tunnel swallowed them. Dark, wet, crowded. The worst possible place to lead civilians under stress. Also the only path left that wasn't already a coffin. Behind them, the gallery fight intensified. Darcy's assault team believed the Americans were still fixed there with nowhere to go. Good. Let them. Theo rigged a last surprise before falling back, clipping a defensive charge to the frame of the breech door and stringing the trigger low in the smoke. Not elegant. Effective. Mick covered him, firing one-handed around the corner while keeping weight off the damaged leg. Ready, Theo said. Then let's stop renting this room. They withdrew into the tunnel. Seconds later, the West Side assault element stormed the gallery. The charge detonated. The blast did not kill all of them. It did something almost as valuable. It turned order into chaos at exactly the moment Nate needed distance. Dust, flame, and steel fragments filled the chamber behind them. Shouts echoed down the pipe spine. Darcy's clean timing fractured. The tunnel march became a test of discipline none of the hostages had trained for, and all of them somehow met. The fevered man collapsed once. Ruiz got to back up. The teenager began hyperventilating in the dark. Elias reached back without turning, put 2 fingers against the kid's wrist, and squeezed in a slow, breathing rhythm until the kid matched it. The older engineer slipped on algae and nearly brought the whole line down. Mick, limping hard now, caught him by the collar and lifted him like a crate. Theo checked signal every 10 steps with the last surviving transmitter. Static, static, static. Then, for 3 precious seconds, a return pulse. Weak, distant, but real. He transmitted everything in a compressed whisper burst. East outflow spill chamber. 18 civilians. 1 wounded operator. Enemy leader moving north pier. Request immediate intercept and lights negative. No confirmation came. He sent it again anyway. Ahead, the tunnel widened into the inland cistern room Elias had mapped from memory and instinct. 3 enormous fuel tanks loomed overhead like sleeping giants, their curved sides sweating with condensation. A metal stair climbed to a maintenance apron open on one side to the storm, and, beyond that, the eastern outflow mouth where seawater crashed in silver lines through basalt. Almost there. Then the overhead hatch banged open. Darcy, not alone, for fighters with him. One carrying a waterproof case roughly the size of a suitcase, another with a field radio, all moving fast toward the north side ladder that led down to the boat route. For the first time all night, Darcy and Nate Coulter saw one another clearly at close range. Darcy was slimmer than intelligence photos suggested, beard trimmed short, eyes unreadably flat. A rain cape hung off one shoulder. He did not look surprised long, just long enough to understand the entire operation had gone wrong in some hidden place he had not secured. Then his weapon came up. The cistern room exploded. Close quarters fights have none of the romance distance can fake. They are noise and angles and ugly fractions of a second. Nate fired first and hit the radio man. Darcy dropped behind the ladder support as the case carrier spun and fell backward down 2 steps. Mick took a round across the upper arm and still kept shooting. Ruiz shoved 3 civilians behind a tank strut and drew blood from a fighter trying to flank the line. Theo went to one knee at the base of the stair and turned measured fire into a wall no one could cross cleanly. Elias moved somewhere to Nate's right and vanished from conscious view, because that is what truly competent people sometimes do in violence. They leave only effects. One enemy tried to bring a grenade into the room. He died before the spoon released. Another fired blind down the stairwell. Sparks blew off the tank's skin and rounds whined into darkness. Darcy used the confusion well. He kicked the waterproof case toward a subordinate and shouted for the north ladder. Even now, he was prioritizing the package. Not his men, not the room. The package that told Nate everything he needed to know about the strategic weight of what Darcy was carrying, and about the kind of man Darcy had always been. The case carrier bolted for the ladder. A suppressed shot hit him through the back of the knee. He folded. The case skidded across wet metal and slammed into a tank footing. Darcy turned toward the shot just in time to see Elias rising from behind a maintenance manifold where no one had noticed a move. Water still dripped off the chief's sleeves. His cheek was slick with someone else's blood. His eyes looked almost bored. Darcy fired first and missed by inches. Elias fired once and took Darcy through the side, plate below the ribs. Not center mass. Oblique. Bad, but not instantly fatal. Darcy crashed into the ladder rail, lost the weapon, and disappeared down the far side into the storm. "Moo!" Nate shouted, because killing the leader is useful. Catching the leader with the package is better. Losing the civilians during the chase would be unforgivable. They split the difference. Ruiz and Theo got the hostages onto the maintenance apron above the outflow spill chamber. Mick followed, bleeding more freely now, still refusing to look at the wound because looking would make it real. Nate and Elias pursued Darcy along the north catwalk through sheets of rain and a confusion of rusted piping that turned every footstep into a gamble. Below, at the outflow mouth, the sea was chaos. But through the chaos, Theo saw something that made his exhausted brain almost fail to process it. Lights. Low. Hooded. Brief flashes from outside the reef. Once. Twice. Pause. Once. Friendly recognition. He laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the human body sometimes has no other outlet when despair breaks in reverse. "Boat," he shouted. "East side. East side." The hostages began to cry in ways adults do when they have spent too long refusing themselves permission. On the north catwalk, Darcy stumbled, but did not stop. Blood marked the rail. He still had enough discipline to move toward the last skiff moored under the lee of the concrete pier. One surviving fighter covered him from the lower landing with wild automatic bursts that kept Nate pinned behind a pump column. Elias, lower and farther right, saw the angle first. He did not try to outshoot the covering fire head-on. He dropped over the catwalk rail into waist-deep runoff along the pier edge, let the water hide his approach, and came in from below the shooter's sight line. The fighter leaned out to reacquire Nate and never saw the hand clamp his ankle. He vanished with one sharp cry. A second later, Elias surfaced beside the piling, seized the lower ladder, and came up with the inevitability of machinery. Darcy had reached the skiff by then. He hauled himself behind the engine housing with one arm, the other pressed to his side, and screamed at the remaining pilot to cast off. The man fumbled the line. The engine coughed. Rain hammered the water flat around them. Nate had no clear shot. Too much pier clutter. Too much motion. Too much chance of hitting the package, assuming it was still in the boat. Elias did, but the shot was nearly impossible. Wind. Rain. Moving platform. Blood loss. Cold damage in the hands after hours of immersion. Target partially obscured. Glass, steel, and engine block complicating the line. The kind of shot that, if missed, becomes a story told later in the bitter language of almost. He settled anyway. This is what people misunderstand about great shooters. They think the miracle is in the trigger pull. It is not. It is in the elimination of every irrelevant thought before the trigger pull happens. Elias did not think about the screaming on the east apron, or the freezing water in his sleeves, or whether Darcy was reaching for a weapon, or whether support boats were seconds away, or what would happen if he failed. He thought about the scene where the skiff's engine housing met the rear support rail, about the fraction of Darcy's head and shoulder that would rise above it when the boat pitched over the next swell, and about the way crosswind would push over water at that exact distance. The skiff rose. Darcy turned. Elias fired. The round passed through spray, clipped the rail, corrected just enough, and entered high through Darcy's orbital bone. The warlord went backward without drama. One instant animate, calculating, dangerous. The next simply mead under rain. The pilot froze. Nate's command hit him like a slap. And he raised them. Across the compound, the last of Darcy's organized resistance finally broke. Some fighters ran inland. Some threw down weapons. Some kept firing because surrender takes a kind of courage not all armed men possess. But the shape of the night was finished. Their commander was dead. Their boats were compromised. Their gallery trap had failed. The hostages were out. And now, at last, the rescue package arrived in force. Two low-profile maritime craft crossed the eastern cut like shadows with engines. Above them, just audible through the weather, came the chopping pulse of rotary blades holding farther offshore than anyone inside the atoll would have thought possible in that ceiling. The first boat nosed into the spill chamber shelf, and operators in dark helmets spilled out, grabbing civilians by shoulders and belts, counting, sorting, pushing them low behind the rock wall, while scanning the compound for any sign the fight might lunge back to life. Relief did not make anyone stupid. It never does when the people involved have earned the right to stay alive. Ruiz handed off the fevered survivor first, then the woman with the rib injury, then the youngest deckhand. He did it in that order because medicine under pressure is a ruthless hierarchy, and because the teenager, for all his terror, could still move on his own. Ruiz's own hands were shaking now, not from fear, from the delayed cost of work done too long in cold, stress, and poor light. He ignored it. He checked Mick instead. The breacher was sitting against the spill wall, rain running off his helmet brim, one hand pressed to the fresh wound in his arm, the other still wrapped around his rifle like he had forgotten how to unclench it. "You done collecting holes?" Ruiz asked. Mick looked down at the blood for the first time all night. "Depends. Are we charging by the wound or by the caliber?" "By the attitude." "Then I'm bankrupt." Ruiz cut away the sleeve, found the path, found the blessing that it had stayed high and missed the joint, and gave himself one private breath of gratitude before moving on. There was no room for speeches. Just hands, tape, pressure. Another body kept in the world one more hour. Theo was already working with the arriving element leader, handing over a compressed download from memory, because half his equipment was dead and the other half deserved burial at sea. Enemy numbers remaining. West Shed's partially active. North Pier compromised, but not clear. One captured pilot. One dead principal likely in the skiff. One waterproof case unconfirmed. Possible additional explosives in the main station. He spoke in clipped fragments, and the other operator answered in equally clipped nods. Two languages of competence overlapping perfectly. "What about Coulter and Van?" the team leader asked. Theo looked toward the North Pier, where the rain and darkness and concrete clutter still hid too much. Still hunting? That was the truth. Because the worst part of reversal is that it can trick people into believing the danger is over. It rarely is. It just changes texture. Dartsea was down, but the island still held wounded fighters, damaged fuel systems, loose munitions, blind corners, and men desperate enough to kill for the privilege of not being taken alive. The package might still be mobile. The skiff might not yet be secured. And Nate Coulter had not spent 15 years in this profession by mistaking a good turn for an ending. He reached the North Pier step behind Elias and saw Dartsea's body slumped half in the bilge wash, one arm trailing in the water as the skiff nudged the piling. The pilot had his hands up and a face gone blank with shock. The waterproof case was there too, jammed under a bench where it had slid during the scramble. Nate covered the pilot. Elias took the case. It was heavier than it looked. He sat on the pier, rolled it once, checked for anti-handling indicators, and read the surface like some men read weather. Fresh latches. Secondary sealant. Not a decoy. Dartsea had bled, trying to keep this moving. That meant it mattered. Nate searched the dead warlord quickly and found what he expected. Spare magazine. Satellite handset. 2 keys. Morphine auto-injector unopened. Dartsea had been willing to numb himself only after escape. Another tiny detail. Another window into the man. Control first, comfort later. The same trait that made him dangerous had also made him predictable. Elias looked down at the body for exactly 1 second, then away. No triumph. No ceremony. People who do this long enough stop confusing necessity with celebration. From inland came a burst of panicked gunfire, and then the fast, flat answer of the rescue element clearing west to east. The compound was being reduced now, room by room, angle by angle, into something law could process instead of something violence still owned. "Package secure," Nate said into the first working comms handed to him. The answer came through a storm of static and engine noise, but it was clear enough. "Copy secure. Extract east. Air window opening 6 mics. 6 minutes." It sounded generous until you remembered the island was still armed, wet, unstable, and trying to burn. On the spill apron, the hostages were loaded by ability, walking wounded first with a hand on the shoulder in front. Non-ambulatory next on soft stretchers, improvised from rigid boards and slings. The older engineer refused to board until he had counted everyone from his crew twice. A woman in an oil-stained coverall kept saying thank you to no one in particular, as if gratitude itself were a rope she was afraid to let go of. The teenager who had nearly broken in the tunnel asked Ruiz in a whisper whether the thing in the water had been a person. Ruiz looked past him to where Elias and Nate emerged from the north side, carrying the case between them. "Yeah," Ruiz said. "Just a person." The teenager nodded, but the look on his face said the answer had not made the night less strange. That mattered too, because legends are usually just competence witnessed by the unprepared. The exfiltration did not happen cleanly. Nothing that honest ever does. A wounded fighter hidden beneath the catwalk tried one last burst from behind a rusted compressor. Theo saw the muzzle flare, dropped flat, and returned 2 rounds before the man finished the sweep. One round clipped the outer casing of the waterproof package and ricocheted off the pier into the dark. Everyone on the shelf froze for half a heartbeat at the idea of losing the whole mission to one panicked man with blood in his eyes. Then the casing held. The world kept moving. At the west sheds, a burning spill finally found old fuel residue and turned one storage bay into a rolling orange furnace. Heat belched across the yard. Metal screamed. A stack of munitions cooked off in ugly little pops. Not enough to change the fight, but enough to remind everyone that this island had become one bad delay away from becoming uninhabitable. Mick nearly passed out boarding the second craft, and would later swear he had simply sat down too hard. Ruiz did not bother arguing. He jammed in 4, strapped him in, and moved on. Theo stayed on the rock until the last civilian was accounted for, repeating names from a grease pencil tally on his wrist as if the syllables themselves were ballast. One missing? Check again. One duplicate? Check again. One name spoken with no face answering? Check again until the face appears or the truth becomes something colder. When the count finally matched the manifest plus live rescues, he closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, and no longer. Elias boarded last, not because anyone ordered him to, because men like him always seem to drift to the outer edge of the group until someone else is safe enough that their own body can become real again. As he stepped into the craft, his knee buckled. It was small, easy to miss. Nate did not miss it. "You're done standing," the lieutenant said. Elias glanced at him. "We're not clear yet. You could be horizontal and still be mean." Elias considered that, then sat against the inner tube like a man accepting a compromise with gravity rather than with pain. The boat kicked away from the spill chamber just as the first helicopter came low enough to matter. It never fully landed. No space. No certainty. Just a hover over the eastern rocks. Rotor wash flattening rain and spray while a rescue line dropped for the most critical casualties. Ruiz sent the fevered surveyor first. Then the woman with collapsing respiratory effort. Then Mick, who protested on principle and lost on policy. The rest of them rode out by water through the reef cut, engines low, eyes still on the island in case anything followed. Nothing did. Carrot Atoll shrank behind them in black shapes and intermittent fire. For a few minutes, the old station looked less like a battlefield than a dying machine, venting its last bad heat into the storm. Then distance turned it into a bruise on the horizon. Only then did the body begin collecting debts. The hostages shivered uncontrollably as shock, cold, and relief finally negotiated a truce. One crewman vomited over the side and apologized 3 times. Another started laughing and could not stop. Ruiz moved among them with blankets, chem lights, and the patient authority of someone who had long ago learned that survival is not a switch. It is a long return. Theo sat hunched around the remains of his comms rig, rainwater dripping off cables that had saved lives by refusing to die cleanly. One of the rescued engineers touched his sleeve and said, very softly, "We heard him." In the water, Theo followed the man's gaze to Elias, who sat at the far end of the craft, head tipped back, eyes half closed, hands still resting near his weapon even now. "What did you hear?" Theo asked. The engineer swallowed. "Nothing. That was the terrible part. We kept hearing shots and seeing men fall, and when we looked there was only water." Theo gave the smallest nod. "That sounds like him." On the assault ship, the aftermath became administrative before it became emotional. That is how institutions protect themselves from the scale of what human beings do inside them. Weapons clear. Wounded routed. Civilians separated for treatment and identification. Prisoners zip-tied and searched again. Package transferred to technical custody under layers of signatures and hard cases. Statements queued. Timelines built. Evidence tagged. Blood washed off decks because ships keep moving even when the people on them would rather stand still. Darcy's waterproof case turned out to contain exactly what Command had feared and hoped in equal measure. The stolen guidance architecture, modified routing keys, and a transfer ledger linking his network to buyers far beyond the atoll. In other words, the mission had not only saved lives, it had ripped open a whole supply chain. There would be other operations because of that case. Other names, other rates, other nights no one outside certain walls would ever know about. But in the immediate hours after, none of that mattered as much to the men who had been there as simpler things. Ruiz finding out the fevered surveyor stabilized after fluids and warming. Theo learning that his incomplete transmissions had been enough to pull the maritime package east. Mick waking after a medic's pain dose and asking if anyone had at least saved the door hinge he blew. Nate standing in debrief, still soaked to the bone, replaying every decision in order, because leadership after a fight is a trial you conduct against yourself before anyone else gets the chance. And Elias Van, sitting under harsh white medical light with a blanket over his shoulders, finally looking like what he had been for hours, a man badly overdrawn on heat, blood, and muscle. The corpsman assigned to him cut away the outer layers and found bruising along the ribs, a laceration at the bicep, deep abrasions on the thigh where rebar had opened him in the channel, and the kind of cold exposure that turns fingers clumsy long after the mission is over. She asked him how long he had been in the water. He gave her an estimate. She stared at him. "That is not a normal number." "No," Elias said. "Did you lose a fin in that channel?" "Yes." "And you kept moving?" "Yes." She looked as if she wanted a more elaborate explanation for the choices of men like him, and knew none would come. So she wrapped his arm tighter and told him, with the weary authority of military medicine, that being difficult was not a personality trait she had time to honor. He almost smiled. Almost. The debrief ran until dawn bled color into the eastern horizon. Nate gave his account first. Contact time, ambush geometry, hostage exposure, comms degradation, tide effects, movement decisions. He was careful with praise, because leaders who praise too soon often hide mistakes behind warmth. But when the interviewer asked how the team regained initiative, Nate answered without hesitation. Chief Van redefined the battle space. The phrasing made the intelligence officer look up, meaning Darcy built a trap around our expected behavior, then stopped behaving inside the trap. Later Theo put it differently. He made the island lie to them. Ruiz was less poetic. He saved every one of us. Mick, arm bound and lip split, said, put in the record that he also ruined a perfectly good local ghost story. Even in rooms built for evidence, that line got the first tired laugh of the morning. The hostages gave statements too, fragmented at first. Shock does that. Then clearer. Several described hearing guards panic about something in the water. Two said they saw a face rise between the pilings, pale in the spray. The older engineer told investigators, very earnestly, that when the rescue finally reached the tunnel room, he thought myth had come for them before reason returned. The teenage deckhand refused to say Mermaid because the word embarrassed him, but he kept asking whether the sniper had really come through the ocean alone. Word spread the way word always spreads after operations everybody pretends are compartmented better than they are. Not names, not locations, shapes, a coastal station, a failed trap, a sniper in the surf, men screaming about a sea spirit right before their line collapsed. Within 48 hours, the cleaner version of the story had reached other teams in 3 different theaters, each retelling adding just enough distortion to make the truth easier to carry. By the following week, the phrase "reef mermaid" had become the sort of joke only people very close to violence can make without disrespecting it. Quiet, dark, almost affectionate. The joke survived because the facts beneath it were solid enough to tolerate humor. The official report did not use the word once. Official reports never do. They said hostile force morale degraded due to unexpected fires from the eastern littoral approach. They said Chief Petty Officer Van utilized a submerged mobility corridor to establish an asymmetric firing position and disrupt enemy command and control. They said Lieutenant Coulter executed adaptive hostage recovery under compounded environmental constraint. They said corpsman intervention preserved multiple friendly and civilian lives. They said one high-value target was neutralized while attempting maritime escape. All true, also hopelessly incomplete, because the report could not capture the sound of frightened men shooting at water. It could not capture the way a hostage's face changes when he realizes rescue has arrived from a direction despair told him was impossible. It could not capture the discipline required to keep pulling a trigger with cold, damaged hands while your body begs to stop being wet, to stop being hurt, to stop being necessary. And it definitely could not capture the strange emotional weight that settled over the team in the days after, when the adrenaline thinned out and ordinary objects became unexpectedly loaded. Ruiz unfolding one of his daughter's sea animal drawings and staring a little too long at the cartoon fish with crooked eyes. Theo standing on the weather deck at dusk, checking the horizon out of habit, and then realizing there was no reason to anymore. Mick asking for solid food, then falling asleep halfway through the first tray because recovery had finally claimed him. Nate writing the casualty in actions summary with the care of a man who understands that paperwork is one of the last forms of loyalty available after the shooting stops. And Elias, once his hands stopped trembling from rewarming, doing what men like him often do after surviving something that might easily have killed them. He tried to vanish back into routine. Clean weapon, dry gear, replace lost fin, rebuild drag bag seal, fold wet charts, say very little. But the thing about nights that become legends inside small circles is that they cling to the people who made them, no matter how stubbornly those people reject attention. 2 days later, the rescued surveyors were cleared to transit off ship. Before they left, the older engineer asked to see the sniper from the tunnel. No one promised anything. Then, because ships are ships and human beings remain human even inside sealed systems, the meeting happened anyway in a quiet passage near medical. The engineer approached Elias with the awkward dignity of a man not used to ceremony and even less used to emotion in public. He held a folded page torn from a notepad. "My granddaughter draws," he said. "I asked for paper. I wrote down what happened before I forgot it wrong." Elias glanced at the folded page, but did not take it immediately. "You do not need to do that. I know." That answer mattered. Gratitude offered freely always matters more than gratitude demanded. Elias took the page. On it, in unsteady block letters, the man had written a version of the line he wanted his family to understand if anyone ever asked what rescue felt like in that place. "We thought the sea was empty until it stood up and fought for us." Elias looked at the sentence, then at the man, and gave a nod so small it might have escaped anyone who did not know him. "Get home," he said. The man's eyes watered anyway. There would be commendations, though not the kind civilians imagine. No parade, no camera, no dramatic reading over orchestra. Just formal language, closed doors, and citations with sections blacked out so heavily they looked ashamed of their own honesty. Nate got one for leadership under adaptive combat conditions. Ruiz got one for life-saving treatment under fire. Theo got one for restoring communications and coordinating extraction from a denied position. Mick got one for breaching and rearguard action despite multiple wounds. Elias's citation, the one eventually placed in a folder and read by fewer people that deserved to read it, was written in that stiff institutional dialect that somehow made the reality underneath feel even bigger. For extraordinary heroism, conspicuous gallantry, and tactical initiative while exposed to sustained enemy fire and severe maritime hazard. Still not enough. It would never be enough. Because what mattered most about that night was not that one sniper killed a lot of bad men. That was the easy version, the cheap version, the version titles use because titles need impact, and the truth is often quieter. What mattered was that one man understood the environment more deeply than the enemy who occupied it. He understood that the tide was not background. It was timing. That darkness was not absence. It was a tool. That fear in superstitious fighters could be bent until it snapped. That hostage rescue is not about charging hardest. It is about seeing the geometry nobody else sees before time runs out. That competence, real competence, can feel supernatural to people who have never watched it operate at full extension. Years later, pieces of the story still surfaced in odd places. A contractor on another ship who swore he heard about an island where militiamen emptied magazines into the surf because they thought the water was hunting them. An intelligence analyst who noticed 3 separate detainee interrogations from unrelated cells all mentioned some version of the same rumor. Never trust a quiet shoreline when Americans disappear beneath it. A former hostage who, back home, kept a framed sketch by his desk of black rocks, white surf, and a shape rising where no one expected help to come from. Even the teenage deckhand, long after, would tell his own children that courage sometimes looks like noise and speed, but the most frightening courage he had ever seen was nearly silent and came out of the sea. As for the team, they did what teams always do. They moved on. Another brief. Another target folder. Another strip of coastline somewhere else in the world where men with weapons had mistaken isolation for safety. But some nights remain inside the bloodstream. Not as trauma alone. As measure. Care became that kind of measure. A reference point. When new operators asked older ones what it meant to trust a teammate's preparation, somebody would eventually mention the atoll without naming it. When conversations drifted toward romantic nonsense about lone wolves and impossible heroes, someone who knew better would cut in and say the same thing Nate said in debrief. He redefined the battle space. Not magic, not myth. Preparation meeting pressure so completely that frightened men reached for a fairy tale because the truth was too disciplined to believe. And if you strip away the title, the rumor, the dark humor, and the retellings that grew around it, that is the line that remains. The enemy thought the ocean was empty. They thought they had trapped the right men in the right place with the right mathematics of fear. They thought tide, steel, hostages, darkness, and time all belonged to them. Then the black water rose. A SEAL sniper came up out of the reef with cold in his lungs and precision in his hands, and the night remembered whose side skill was really on.